Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Thomas, for the invitation to be part of this very interesting forum. So my topic is on nuclear energy, policies and politics, especially in Australia. Now, if Tom Hatton is right and I'm addressing an audience of geeks, then be patient because the speaker after me, Barry Brooks, will satisfy your needs. I'm going to keep my comments at a kind of a general narrative level. So the principles of electricity were discovered in the 19th century, and the use of electric power became widespread following the invention of the incandescent light globe in the 1870s. And a few years ago, in 2008, the US National Academy of Engineers set out their views following a survey of their members of what were the 20th century's most significant engineering achievements. And in order of priority, number one was electrification. And that was then followed by a gap by the automobile, airplanes, water supply and distribution, electronics, radio and television, down to agricultural mechanisation, computers, telephony, air conditioning and refrigeration. This is in the age before the internet, of course. But such a list, I think, helps us to agree with the central place that electricity plays in our lives today and the responsibility that electricity and electrification has had in producing the prosperity that we enjoy, especially here in Australia. Unfortunately, sometimes our political leaders don't have the same respect or treat these policy issues as seriously as they should. So, to nuclear power. Currently, worldwide share of electricity generation is about 12 to 13%, and there are about 390 reactors around the world currently operating and producing electricity in the post-Fukushima period. There are about 60 reactors under construction, roughly half of which are being built in China, and the leading economies for use of nuclear power and commitment to nuclear energy are obviously the US, the European Union, Russia, and particularly China, India, etc. Now, you can't really talk in a balanced way around nuclear energy without using the Fukushima accident as a reference point. So prior to Fukushima, which was March the 11th in 2011, this was the situation. The general feeling around the world was that there was a renaissance, that was the word that was used, in the relevance and support for nuclear power. A bit hyperbolic, but it sort of captured the mood at the time. Within Australia, polls were showing that more Australians were in support of nuclear power than against. That was quite a shift over a period of 10 or 20 years. Very strong gender divide. Men as a group, very supportive of nuclear power. Women as a group, generally against nuclear power. Outside of Australia, there was a growing list of participants in the nuclear industry. Certainly new vendors were emerging. Other than the French, the UK and the Americans, we had the Chinese and the Koreans, and we saw important economies, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Central Europe, all commit to increasing the use of nuclear energy in their mix, part of a strategy, or to satisfy a strategy to get a kind of diversified balance in their platforms, and partly to shift the electricity generation into cleaner forms of production. Yes, there were questions that everybody still had and that were not completely convincingly answered. The management of long-lived radioactive waste, community resistance to being co-resident with power stations, access to water, matching the scale of large reactors to the demand from smaller cities and populations, cost overruns, project management, etc. And sort of down the list, the possibility of another major accident. Well, that possibility became a certainty when Fukushima hit. Just quickly on Fukushima, the earthquake magnitude 9, about 100 kilometres off the coast of northeast Japan. Very severe earthquake, 18 metre shear in the sea floor. At the surface of the sea, a pulse of about 40 metres height, radiated east and west. The eastern travelling pulse led to tidal surges along Canada, US and South America. It didn't do any serious damage, only a few $1 billion as it turns out. When the pulse that went west travelled very fast, about 170 kilometres an hour at the source, slowed as it hit the coast, took about 40 minutes, but at that point the tsunami was about, it varied, but between 6 and 14 metres high. The waterfront travelled about 10 kilometres inland in some parts of Japan, left 19,000 people dead. Just over 90% of those people were drowned. 11 operating reactors in the path shut down automatically and safely. 6 of those reactors were in Fukushima, 3 of which were operating at the time, all of which shut down before they were then submerged by the tsunami, which at 14 metres overwhelmed the roughly 6 metre high seawall that was there. In flooding the sites, knocked out backup power, then supplementary power. Loss of power of all kinds on a nuclear plant is devastating. The fuel rods in the reactors that were operating overheated. It definitely had a serious core meltdown in each of the 3 reactors. But no fatalities on the site from the operation of the nuclear plants. 5 employees died from the tsunami, drowned and crushed, etc. But it was an accident at the highest level of severity in the nuclear scale, equal to Chernobyl. Probably not as severe as Chernobyl, but certainly in that group. And as a result, today there still are concerns around the contamination of the seabed and the ocean near the nuclear plant, although by and large there's a sense that there's been no measurable health effect on the populations around Fukushima and in Japan. The total cost of the damage to Fukushima hasn't been announced, but it's of the order of $50 billion, and the total cost of the tsunami and earthquake, etc., on the Japanese economy is going to be about $300 billion. Just to give you scale, because those numbers look very big, and they are, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill at about the same time is about a $50 billion event, and Superstorm Sandy in October of 2012 is another $50 billion. Everything in this industry is $50 billion. It's a quantum phenomenon, $50 billion at a time. Now, shortly after Fukushima, Switzerland, Belgium and Germany decided to phase out nuclear power. Italy, Thailand and Sweden paused in their new programs. And Japan, that had ambitions to have half of their electricity generated by nuclear reactors in the 2030s, stopped, paused, reversed, and have had a number of policy changes, but it's clear their nuclear aspirations have been considerably moderated. The UK, the US have done checks on their networks and pronounced them fine. China, India, Russia and Middle Europe retain their aggressive plans to grow their nuclear fleet. And a country like Finland, which is convenient for Australia to compare a number of metrics with, including the quality of their educational system and the sophistication of their trained people. That's interesting, because on one side they have Norwegian gas and hydroelectric power available to them, and on the other side they have Russian gas and coal, but instead they have committed to growth in their nuclear generation, which accounts for about a third of their electricity today and will get to about 50% in the next decade or so. The reviews of Fukushima criticised the siting of reactors in geologically active zones. In a community like this, you sort of say, well, that's hardly a brilliant insight, but there you go. The Japanese do some things brilliantly well, but the location of some of these reactors obviously has been poor. The need to design hardened containment structures better than what was available in those reactors. Cooling water must never become a single point of failure or be dependent upon a single point of failure. Better monitoring instrumentation, backup power, crisis management and communication, and the importance of strong independent national regulators. Been a loss of confidence in the Japanese system. The Japanese people have paid by having shut down 52 of their 54 reactors and importing at an annual rate of about $60 billion of cash, LNG and coal, very good for our export industries, difficult for the Japanese economy, not great for the global climate. The trauma associated with being in the vicinity of a nuclear plant is less about the probability that you will suffer from radiation damage, from the fallout, etc. But there's no doubt, as we found with Chernobyl, the displacement of people from contaminated areas and the dislocation in their lives and in their careers and amongst their families is a substantial trauma, accompanied by all sorts of problems with those communities that those people have and in their mental health, and that this issue is much greater and still is in Japan, where about 100,000 people have remained displaced, than the often referenced concerns about radiation exposure. So let me just remind you of what the pros are, the advantages, or what the proponents of nuclear power, and I am one of them, believe to be the advantages. And I know I speak to an informed audience, so this is the shorthand. Nuclear power is a baseload technology. It's proven. You can order a reactor, you know exactly what you're going to get. You do not have to make assumptions that in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time there will be a breakthrough in the way it performs, in its uptime, in its cost. In the case of Australia, we have a benign geology and we have multiple choices of location. That's not to diminish the challenges we might have with social and community issues. Nuclear power is demonstrably low emission. It is clean. It is cost competitive in a carbon constrained world. It is not at the same cost as coal and gas is today. Nothing is. But as soon as we put a modest price on carbon, or we accept renewable energies at a higher cost, nuclear will appear to be not only competitive, it may well be the most competitive of the alternatives. Yes, in Australia we have access to uranium, that's convenient. We have a very, very good regulatory system and the disciplines associated with our regulatory system, and we do have sophisticated workforces and educational institutions. They're the advantages, they're the pros. There are a comparable list of cons. The management of long-lived radioactive waste is an issue everywhere. There is no single national repository operational which stores spent fuel rods and long-lived waste from nuclear power stations. This is not a technical or engineering issue. It's a social issue. The actual management of spent fuel rods is a straightforward engineering process, and the solutions are well understood. But the location of national repositories tends to be controversial, and there still are a number of political issues in different jurisdictions that have got in the way of completion of national repositories, although in the next 10 or so years we will have operating repositories in countries like Sweden, Finland and the UK. The costs of nuclear power continue to rise, and whenever you have a major accident such as we've had in Fukushima, additional layers of precautionary systems, regulatory and safety compliance required, necessary, no question about that, are added. That means that these reactors become more costly and more complicated. In Australia, since we do not have a nuclear industry and we do not have the system in place yet to support a nuclear industry, if people of goodwill decided today to go nuclear, it's at least 10 years, perhaps 15 years before the first reactors will be available. There are some people out there, though not this group, who think that unless we move in the next 5 years, we're all doomed. So if that's your thinking, nuclear is not part of the solution, but if you have a more reasoned approach, in my view, then nuclear power could become part of the solution in Australia in the 2020s. We do have an issue with where you would locate nuclear reactors. Suppose you had 50 reactors in Australia. That's enough to power up all of our needs, more or less. They're usually built in clusters of 2, 3 or 4, so you need to find a dozen or so reactors. Given the size of these reactors and the market, they're almost always going to be on the eastern seaboard. So you've got to find about a dozen locations on the eastern seaboard. The early generations will probably be co-located with coal-fired power stations. Just going down the list of reservations, obviously concerns about catastrophic accidents, sovereign risk, You could start a major investment program today only to find the change of government changes the rules on you, and we're talking very, very large numbers here in terms of dollar exposure, so business people are going to be cautious in this area. Access to water is also an issue for nuclear power stations, as it is in other areas as well. So, they're the pros and the cons. What are the policy issues for us here in Australia? How serious are we about the gravity of climate change and the importance of moving to low emission technologies in Australia? I think there's not too much debate about the global issues, but whether an early mover strategy within Australia is appropriate remains a contentious topic amongst policymakers. An earlier Secretary of the Department of Energy and Climate in the UK made the point that if the UK was confronted with a choice between energy security and climate change, energy security wins every time. That's an issue we need to sort out in Australia as well. We've got to be prepared to have a proper debate about the relative costs and implementation risks and technology risks with all of the alternatives that are in front of us, which includes all of the topics that are on today's agenda, plus some. That is, we can't approach this debate from an ideological point of view. We've got to have an evidence-based, data-based, proper discussion in order for governments and society in general in countries like Australia to make an informed judgment about what sort of energy strategy we wish to support over the next several decades. We need to understand what our skill sets and educational needs are going to be in support of a lot of these technologies that you've heard today. Community attitudes are not well known. What I can tell you is, having worked at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation in Lucas Heights, that when surveys are taken by small geographic sort of council level areas, the community that is most supportive of nuclear power and nuclear reactors is the community around the Lucas Heights reactor, the Sutherland Shire. When you think about it, it sort of makes sense. People have lived adjacent to a reactor since the 1950s. They have family members that work there. The organisation does a good job in interacting with the community. And once people learn how to work, or once people's understanding of nuclear reactors and nuclear networks is improved, they by and large make rational or use reason to inform their opinions. We do not have a bipartisan approach to energy strategy. It's a problem. And we're still left, when it comes specifically to nuclear energy, uncertain as to what the real issues are. Are they financial? Are they technical? Are they political? Well, they are political. Are they social? Let me just give you a quick rundown as what's changed in the last few years. For example, in the time of the current Labor government, so 2007, it's just a convenient time. It's not meant to be a partisan political comparison here. So the Labor government, which is generally viewed to be not friendly to nuclear power, since 2007 ended the Hawke era 3 mines policy, so we're now authorising additional mining of uranium and export of uranium after a gap since 1983, have entered into bilateral agreements with Russia and China for the export of yellowcake, have agreed to export uranium to India, and we're now negotiating as a nation the terms and conditions of that. They've legislated for a low-level nuclear repository in the Northern Territory. They've continued their investment in Lucas Heights, as well as support of the Australian synchrotron, and now the states have followed by permitting uranium exploration and development in Western Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. That's all in the last 5 or 6 years. So let me wrap up and perhaps leave some time for views that may or may not be supportive of mine on this one. I reckon that our recent national debate about greenhouse gases and emissions trading scheme is really just a first step as part of a larger agenda. In my view, the main game is to design an evolutionary path along which the Australian economy progressively reduces its dependence upon fossil fuels while enhancing its productivity and competitiveness. I do not support the embracing of exotic technologies because they are clean. You've got to have a look at the economic consequences of those decisions. I think nuclear power must be in the mix, and we could clearly benchmark with the French, who have been in the state where nearly 80% of their electricity has been nuclear generated by now 58 reactors since the 1980s. We are handicapped by not having a bipartisan agreement around nuclear power. We do have sophisticated nuclear reactors that we can resource up at the right time. We're not ready from a tertiary education level and training, but the cycle time for that is quite quick. We could aim to have 10 reactors up and running by the early 2030s. That's about a quarter of our electricity generation. A reference point that I think is appropriate. It's been used earlier today. But it does mean we have to have clarity about our energy strategy. And Thomas, on that, I might just finish. The energy white paper that was published earlier this year or late last year, offered the promise of a coherent, far-sighted energy strategy. And it missed by a large margin. Why? Because the mandate was design the optimum energy strategy for Australia by 2050. Do not consider nuclear power. Do not confront the starting carbon price. These are political mandates, which are understandable. And make sure that at the end you configure a system that leads you to an 80% reduction in emissions relative to the year 2000, without any reference to risk, probability of technologies being available, or cost. This is no way to approach something as important as energy, and which I think will be just as important for us in the 21st century as it has been in the 20th. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. Also refreshing to have a talk without death by PowerPoint. So also a good interjection there. So I'm sure there are lots of questions.
At Tony Klein, University of Melbourne, did not allude to one of the most important social aspects of the issue, and that is radiation phobia, the unreasonable fear in the community for what is in fact something that surrounds us all the time, nuclear radiation and the associated risks.
Look, obviously that you're right, Tony. It was quite interesting after the Fukushima incident, and as some months later, as people began to form a view as to the risks, etc., and the fallout from Fukushima, and there were still concerns about contaminated food, contaminated drinking water, etc. The observation was made that the biggest risk that confronted people in the sort of fallout footprint of Fukushima was not the radiation. It was the fact that they all wanted to go home and go back to where they would be once again exposed to the risk of earthquake and tsunamis. It's the risks of that are so much greater than the radiation exposure, even from a catastrophic accident. We as society and as individuals find it hard to get the relativities right. And it's quite right. If you want to run a scare campaign that's anti-nuclear, you hint at the dark, undisclosed consequences of exposure to radiation. And there's one very well-known campaigner, anti-nuclear campaigner, who in a forum like this would say, don't trust the nuclear industry. They haven't told you about all of the genetic problems associated, and it goes on from there. And I can tell you, having attempted to approach this in a kind of rational way, I can't find any of those problems. So it's an issue. We have to find a way to address it, Tony.
Okay. Tony Vassallo.
Tony Vassallo from the University of Sydney. Just a couple of quick comments, if you can. You didn't mention proliferation as one of the cons, I guess, for nuclear power. We've had engineering failures with Chernobyl and natural disasters with Fukushima. Is the industry prepared for a potential, deliberate release of radioactive material from diversion of fuel? And secondly, who's going to invest in a plant that will take 40 years to sort of depreciate and get return on investment, given the unknowns in terms of demand and electricity pricing? does it still need government support to get a plant up? Has anyone built a nuclear power station using private money?
Two good questions. Let me take the second one first. When I and a few people in this room did a review of the industry 5 or 6 years ago, and we travelled around the world looking at various nuclear installations in countries, we asked the question, were there any examples of nuclear reactors that were built without some involvement of the government? The answer is no. Most of the early reactors came as a result of military programs, and others have been built in countries with strong central government and strong support from government-owned utilities. So that's a legitimate concern. That is, if you want to start a nuclear power industry, could you do it with just private money? I suspect you can't. Might it have to extend beyond the first 1, 2 or 3 reactors? Maybe not. And maybe government support is best delivered in the form of guaranteed access to funds rather than an equity investment, such as we find in the National Broadband Network. So the answer to your question is, every nuclear industry I'm aware of has started with government leadership. On proliferation, this is an industry that's been around for, since the Second World War. There is a notorious example of the Pakistanis releasing and trading information about nuclear weapons and nuclear fuel cycles. But in fact, in terms of the unlawful movement of nuclear materials, I think the global policing system is quite good. I'm not aware of any breakdowns in that system. Having said that, it's again a case of relativities. If you were inclined to lose sleep about nuclear materials in an uncontrolled environment, then you should have started worrying when the Soviet Union broke down and all of this stuff sort of in various satellites and other moved around, which I'm not sure are fully accounted for. But the modern system is quite impressive, and on the hierarchy of risks, I wouldn't put that as a high risk. The other collateral question there is sometimes, could somebody do something? Is it a target for terrorist activity? Could you create a dirty bomb, etc.? It's never been done. It's hard to do, and I think, and let me add another. It is very, very hard to do.
Okay, there's a last question from the top.
George Paxinos from the University of New South Wales. Thank you for presenting the pros and cons. Some people looking at the same data would think that the scales have tipped for them now after Fukushima. I just want to ask, do you have a threshold after which, like another such incident, you would consider that support for a nuclear is not advisable?
Look, George, Fukushima dealt a near fatal blow to the nuclear industry in the West. The positives have been that in the US and the UK and Europe, people have gone back to their reactors. In some cases, they've had to strengthen the design a little bit, but broadly, the reactors have been certified as technically sound, and the US continues to extend the licenses for existing reactors 10 and 20 years at a time. But it certainly has chilled enthusiasm for nuclear power. Although the UK had a plan to replace all of their reactors and to produce the same level of electricity with nuclear energy with the next generation as they've had in the past, and they appear to be firm in that conviction. The rest of the world, and the Chinese in particular, the Chinese are remarkable at many levels, but in this particular case especially so. They have focused around, first they have enormous unmet energy needs, so nuclear is but one of the technologies they're supporting. They have, 14 or 15 significant reactors underway in place in the civilian network, and they have another 28, I think, being built at the moment. But as importantly, they are becoming the manufacturing centre of excellence for the fission reactors. And I think over time, as we have found with so many other things in the manufacturing space, countries are going to be confronted with China as their primary source of supply for nuclear reactors. That'll create a whole new set of interesting questions that we're seeing in other industries. But it's a long way of saying that China, India, firm in their enthusiasm for nuclear power. The Koreans, very good manufacturers, very good designers, have got a foothold in the Middle East. Central Europe continues to be enthusiastic about nuclear power. That's where the growth will be. And the West is going to look elsewhere.
But for yourself.
Okay, well, wonderful set of questions, and let me thank again the speaker, and please...
Thanks.